Okay, welcome to today's webinar, Innovative Perspectives in Identity, hosted by Good Intelligence in partnership with Lyon and Women on Identity. I hope you're all well and safe. My name is Alan Good and I'm the CEO and Chief Analyst of Good Intelligence. This webinar will explore a number of key themes in identity, including views on trust frameworks, wellness passports, and the impact of COVID on digital, including adoption and fraud. Today's webinar is chaired and moderated by Emma Lindley from Women on Identity, and I will hand over to Emma after some housekeeping points. To ask the question, please use the Q&A facility. We'll have moments within the presentation to answer your questions. We'll get through as many questions as we can, but we'll also make sure we stay on schedule so that the summit flows smoothly. We should follow up with any unanswered questions after the event is finished. Also, we'll be following up after the event with a link to the video recording of this event. It is my great pleasure to now hand over to Emma Lindley from Women on Identity. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Alan. So welcome everybody. As Alan said, we're going to be covering a broad range of topics this afternoon, but they're all going to be topical, quite broad, as I said, but all pretty topical. So we're going to talk about trust frameworks, as Alan said, and then we're going to talk a little bit about wellness passports. All of these things you probably will have seen in the press recently, and then we're just going to talk about the impact again of COVID. So I've got some really great panelists with me today. I'm going to let themselves introduce themselves. That's probably better than me introducing people. So I'm going to go to Charlotte first, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Emma. So my name is Charlotte Said. I work for NatWest Group. I'm currently in the retail strategy and innovation team, and specifically I've been looking at identity and data sharing over the last couple of years, and we see huge opportunities within retail banking for this. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. Ruth.
Hi Emma, my name is Ruth O'Toole and I am Senior Legal Counsel in Lyon. So Lyon is a software solutions and a provider, software identity solutions provider, and in my role I negotiate contracts globally, and I also have a particular interest in data privacy and working with the development teams to make sure that the software and products are privacy compliant.
Great, thanks Ruth. And Lisa.
Thanks, Emma. My name is Lisa Lyon and I'm the Managing Director of My Pension ID, which is an identity app developed specifically for the pension sector in identifying lost pensions, but also verifying people are alive before payment is made.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, Lisa. Right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is trust frameworks. Now, if you live in the UK, you will have seen some information in the press fairly recently, at back end of last year, about a UK trust framework. So the DCMS wrote something about it, UK Finance and others have written about it. And we've also seen people talking about trust frameworks in other countries. But really, what is a trust framework? Now, I've been in the identity industry for quite a long time. I think we like to use really complicated language sometimes, and trust frameworks is no exception. I think we like to make things seem a little bit more complicated than they are, perhaps so that nobody understands it. But essentially, what a trust framework is it's a set of rules really for delivering a service. So users using a service, and particularly when there's multiple organisations delivering that service, everyone needs to know who does what within that and how it's done. An example of this might be the trains and how the trains work. As an example, how they're built and how they're used and how users use them. As a user of a train, we'd want to know there's a set of standards about how the train might be built and how safe the rails are that are actually carrying the train. Well, identity is no different, really, fairly simplistically, except that we call those rules trust frameworks. So, essentially the organisations within the ecosystem know that they can trust each other, and users know that they can trust the service. And if we don't have that system in place and that set of rules, trust is really difficult to establish. So essentially, a trust framework provides the clarity and allows those organisations to work in the ecosystem and provide a system to users. I've got a slide actually that we're just going to pop up to show what a trust framework looks like. Now, this is actually from the Open Identity Exchange. So this is actually their depiction of a trust framework and what it looks like. And so I'm just going to ask the panelists really their view on trust frameworks and the important parts that they think are contained within the trust framework. As I said, this slide is showing the Open Identity Exchange and their version of a trust framework. Other sectors might have different elements contained within the trust framework. Other different countries might have different elements contained within a trust framework, but this is just one depiction of it. And if I'll just quickly run through some of the elements in a trust framework. There's rules and obligations, might be principles, trust marks. So that might be, if you think about the UK, we've got a kite mark when we know that something's certified to be used to a certain safety standard. User experience might be contained within a trust framework. Security and technical requirements, principles, governance, interoperability. And essentially those are the standards that, the organisations and actors know how to deliver a particular service. In this case, it's identity. So I'd just like to ask the panelists of a trust framework, from your perspective, Charlotte, you're from a bank, and Lisa and Ruth, you're from kind of service providers to the industry. What do you think are the most important parts within a trust framework? I'm going to go to Charlotte first of all, just to get your view.
Right, okay. So probably for me, a couple of the areas I'm most interested, especially at the moment, around governance and also interoperability. So right down at the bottom of that diagram. So my previous life was an IT auditor, so governance is a big thing that's on my radar. And I also think, that's a thing that still needs to be conquered a bit around identity if we are going to build out this sort of ecosystem with multiple vendors, banks, the government involved. We need to think about who's going to oversee that. And as a bank, we're used to having our own regulator or oversight through, say, the FCA, but that might not be appropriate for everyone within this sort of framework. So I think for us, that's a big one. And I think that's still something that needs to be worked out. And I think that's something that we could maybe look to other regulators like the ICO potentially to be that oversight for us. And I think it's something that's still to be conquered, like I said. I think the other area is interoperability. So we see multiple vendors coming into this market and lots of different technology solutions. But the question is, how is this all going to knit together? And, governance could help with that too. But I also think we need to think about, where is this all going? At the moment, we don't necessarily see someone or a vendor that's outstanding that's going to lead the way. It's maybe a multi-horse race at the moment. So I think there's also an opportunity for open banking. So that's already set up. We have APIs with customer data available, and there is already some inbuilt sort of framework with that. But then how does that all knit together with things like, TISA, which is running their own scheme with its members. And then we've got decentralized identity and self-sovereign ID. How does that all get knitted together as well? So there's probably a lot to work through there, but to get the size and scale that identity needs, we really need that sort of interoperability piece and the collaboration of, different parties coming together as well to collaborate on it. So those would be my two areas of interest.
I did say that we like to make things more complicated than they necessarily need to be, and Charlotte's just given us a few examples of why we do that or how we do that. Ruth, have you got a view on trust frameworks and the key elements from your perspective?
Yeah, certainly. I think that the user services, so we can see that there in the slide. I think the user services are obviously a key component of any trust framework. So the trust framework is only going to work if the users are engaged and that they participate in it. And I think a key part then of the user services is the creation and management of a digital identity. And this is probably an area that I would be more familiar with then, in my role in Dayon, because Dayon provides both digital onboarding solutions for the creation of a digital identity and then authentication solutions, including biometrics, so that a user and a relying party can interact with each other in a trust framework with confidence. And I think also a big part of building that trust and confidence in that relationship is privacy compliance. So making sure that the user has, for example, clear information in a privacy notice about how any personal data they provide, so say from ID documents to biometrics, so how they're being used. And then also making sure that any products are built with privacy by design principles in place. So making sure that the user has a positive experience and that their privacy is considered from the very outset.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ruth. And Lisa, have you got a view on trust frameworks? Because you're kind of sat in the pension sector. What do you see as being important for that sector?
Picking up on what Ruth said, actually, definitely the trust in the user and the user feeling that they are actually in control of their identity, because identity is such a powerful piece of data, isn't it? And if the user feels that the security around that data is not sufficient, then if they're not going to use it, then as both panelists have said, it's not going to work. And so I think that really needs to be a key focus in any trust framework.
And it's one of those things, I often use the analogy of, the payments industry and how well the payments industry has managed to get that, that trust framework working. That you can pay with your card, and that, if your card gets defrauded, what you can do about it. And essentially we need the same sort of rails for identity. And I think, as I said at the start, what we've seen is this acceleration in trust frameworks, not just in the UK, and there's moved towards trust frameworks not just in the UK but in other countries. And really that's been accelerated from the stuff that I've seen, really, because of the pandemic. And it's all of those issues really that the pandemic has brought with it. And I want to talk to the panelists now really just more about the pandemic and the changes that you have seen and we have seen together, that and the impact that's going to have on the industry. So one of the things that I'm as being sat in the UK, we're obviously seeing a big vaccination rollout now in the UK. And what that's potentially going to bring with it is the ability potentially for us to go out and do more things. But ultimately, the question I think now is, how is that going to happen? We look at the impact on the travel and tourism industry, and I think one of the estimates I saw yesterday is that it's had about a 2 trillion negative impact on that industry, because people haven't been able to travel. We've had this reduction of tourism. And now with this vaccination program starting to get rolled out in various countries, people are going to want to be able to potentially travel again. But ultimately, what we're going to have to see is people being able to prove that they've been vaccinated to travel. We can already see that at airports where they want to check that people have got negative tests. Well, ultimately what we'll want to see, and what governments will want to see, and what hotels will want to see, and what cruise liners will want to see, is that people have been vaccinated in order for them to travel. And again, one of the really topical things that we've seen in the press recently is this link between the potential for digital identity and some sort of wellness pass where someone can prove that they have been vaccinated in order to allow them to travel, to fly, or to get on that cruise liner. So I'm kind of interested in exploring that a little bit more. And I don't know, Ruth, have you got a view just in terms of the role of wellness passports and safe travel, and what part does identity play in all of that?
Yeah, absolutely, Emma. And as you say, look, the pandemic has had an enormous impact on travel, and air travel in particular. I think the stat that I saw was that European air passengers decreased by 70% in 2020 compared to the previous year. So we know there's an enormous impact there, and I think that the role of wellness passports would be to make travel or international travel easier for travellers by allowing them to demonstrate that they meet travel health requirements. So look, one of the big difficulties for travellers is that the health requirements are different depending on the countries that people want to go to, and it's really difficult for individuals, to keep track of what is required and to sort of even meet those requirements maybe when they are in a different country, from their own country, say for example. And Dayon was very conscious of this, and sort of with our background in identity, we developed a new application called Verify to try and address that issue really. And so the Verify app, and what it does is it provides a one-stop shop where travellers can find accurate information on their travel destination's requirements, and then they can meet those requirements in the application. So say, for example, they could complete a questionnaire in the application, or they could upload a copy of a negative COVID test, depending on what is required for that specific destination country. And then the Verify app verifies that the data provided meets the destination country's requirement, and it displays a pass or a tick. And then the traveller can show that green tick to the staff, in the ground staff in the airport, for example, and then it would streamline the check-in process. So that green tick can be used by the airline, who would be the relying party when we think about the trust framework. They can use that to verify that the travel requirements have been met. And actually, Dayon is currently partnering with both American Airlines and British Airways, and Denver Airport, who are using the Verify app to streamline their travel requirements. And then I suppose the second part of that question is, what role does identity play in that? So identity and digital identity is a key part in any in any pass, because it's important to link the health pass with the individual themselves, and then for the relying party, which would be the airline in this case, to be able to authenticate the pass and to match it with the holder. And then when we think about what type of identifiers would be required for that digital identity, I think it can depend on the circumstances on each use case. So, in certain circumstances, a simple identifier, maybe such as a name or an email address or a device identifier, that could be enough to create that digital identity for that pass. Or if a higher level of identity assurance was required, biometrics could have a part to play there. But that would all very much depend on, what would be relevant or proportionate in the circumstances. The Verify solution does have that flexibility built into it. So depending on what would be required.
So I'm just going to ask you another question about that, because I'm interested in. And so is that something that you've developed that sits inside? You talked about American Airlines and British Airways, I think. So is that sitting inside their own app? What's the kind of user journey for a user?
Well, currently it's a companion app. So the Verify app is a standalone app, and then the American Airlines passengers would be directed to use the Verify app.
Okay, super interesting. That's really interesting. So I think one of the other areas I've been kind of thinking about recently is how people are also going to get back to work. So, how are we going to get back to travel? How are we going to get back to, some people might not want to go back to their offices, but say if we did want to go back to our offices, how are organizations going to get people back into work? And I don't know, Charlotte, just from a banking perspective, how you as a bank are thinking about this idea of some kind of wellness app or something like that, and how are you going to get people back into the bank once the vaccination programs have started to be rolled out?
Yeah, identity is something we were looking at anyway, but this, like you say, last year we just saw it getting moved forward a lot. And I think that idea of a wellness passport or a vaccination credential attached to identity is something that could be used going back into the office. It could be like a QR code or something like that gets scanned in. But we're also really focused on, maybe we still have people that want to go into branches. That might be another situation, but also really keen to see businesses get back on their feet and get things moving again with the economy. So we do think there's definitely a role play in that, and perhaps it's just a case of us adding size and scale, you know, to something like that, because you know, something needs to be put in place to ensure that we don't have to go back into situation again. But then, you know, I think we've seen a bit with the NHS app. It's like, how do you incentivize people to use it, you know, because, you know, often we put these things out there, but they don't get picked up for some reason. So, you know, a lot of thinking at the moment is around how do we get people to adopt this type of thing, and especially if there's multiple apps out in the market as well, how do we drive the adoption as well? And it could be a case of a reward or site incentive for using it as well. But it's definitely something we're considering, and thinking about how we can link more into just getting people back up and running and doing, you know, it's not going to be the same, but, you know, doing things, you know, in a way that gets the economy back on its feet. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lisa, have you got a view on that from a, you know, from your perspective at all?
I have actually, yeah. So going back to the travel point of view, so what my pension ID does is, through identity, it will connect the identity to the actual pension. So go back to the vaccine, why not attach, as Charlotte said, through identity, a central database of the NHS of people that have been vaccinated, that multiple use identity providers, because lots of people have got identity apps on their phone. If there was an international standard that was like a tick box, and on that particular app that they had programmed into that, access that database, and then the person uses their app, they go into their digital wallet and it shows whoever they need to show that they have been vaccinated, that would be a fantastic use of identity. And also, but it would have to have that international standard tick of approval to say that that provider had been authorized and had, you know, had access to that particular database. I think that could potentially work really, really well.
So I think that comes back to our point that we started on around trust frameworks, you know, because ultimately all of these things need some kind of framework to work in, whether that, you know, we you know, Charlotte was saying, how do we incentivize people? Well, you know, you've got to have user experience, you've got to have the incentives there for people to do it. But also you were talking there about, you know, standards, some kind of trust marks, so people go, well, actually, I know that I can use this. I know that it's trusted. I know that my data is going to be used in a way that, you know, is adheres to all the kind of privacy principles that I would expect as a user. So, you know, certainly I think and I know there is work around trust frameworks just in this, purely in this space of kind of the wellness apps. But again, it goes back to your point earlier on, Charlotte, about interoperability. So how do you get a trust framework that's being built for wellness to work with a trust framework that's being built for, you know, banking and KYC, for example, and how do those things potentially work together, or do they not? You know, do users have multiple things in their wallet? Okay, all right. So the next thing I wanted to talk on, again, just following this theme of COVID and the way that it's really changed, I mean, everything, but not least just the amount of, you know, people using online services. And with that increase in the use of online services, we've also seen a big increase in online fraud and identity fraud. We know that, you know, CIFAS have reported on this, Interpol have reported on the increase of identity fraud. And I know that we've got a lot of people registered for the webinar today, so I'd like to actually just run a poll, if possible. So I don't know if we can pull the poll up. And the poll is just really to understand if the organisations that are dialed in, the participants, and the question that I wanted to ask is, have you seen an increase in online adoption rates in the last 12 months? So just going to give everyone a chance to answer that. And we're just seeing the answers coming in now. I don't think the answer is going to be a surprise to anyone. Give people another look. Okay, right, cool. So we got about 2/3 of the people that are dialed in today actually vote on this. but 86% of people said that they've seen an increase in online adoption rates in the last 12 months. 2% said no, and we had 12% that actually said that they were unsure. So overwhelmingly, we've seen this this increase. And I think, you know, I'm really interested now to get everyone's viewpoint on what that's actually looked like and the impact that that's had. So my first question, and I'm going to go to Lisa with this, because I know that you're working with a lot of the, you know, pensions companies, and you're in a particular vertical sector. So how have you seen, you know, the pandemic affecting consumer confidence? How's it affected consumer confidence in your view? And you know, with the organisations that you're working with, you know, perhaps the pensions providers, have you, you know, are people kind of changing their habits? So have you got a kind of view on that?
Okay, there's quite a lot there. So
feel free to pick it apart and just pick the part you want to answer. That's all right as well.
Poke me if I've missed something. So as you've said, that we're in the pension sector, and so predominantly we are communicating with the older generation, which historically haven't potentially adopted a digital presence, even though it's been offered by the pension sector. And so we, as a company, we have additionally offered our app as a method of verifying when somebody is asked to verify. And we've seen an increase in adoption rates from our clients, whereas they were talking about, oh yes, yeah, it's a good idea, well, we will adopt that. As soon as COVID hit, where they were relying upon paper-driven exercise, they accelerated their engagement and adoption of the digital process. And when we have offered this out as a side-by-side process, we've seen an uptake of 50% of the consumer for digital. Now, even our clients are flat on their backs with surprise at that statistic because of the older generation that we're dealing with. But I think what's been really, really important is that there is a real change in confidence for the public, but because they not necessarily know how to use digital technology, having that support there and taking them through the process so they've got a little bit of both has really helped those adoption rates. But once they've learned, obviously they don't need to go through that process again. But yes, we've seen a massive spike, and in particular in a sector that has always been difficult to try and crack the digital engagement process.
That's really interesting. I'm sure, Charlotte, you've got some views on this, you know, being in the banking sector, because you'll have a wide range of customer base. There's some that sit in that demographic and the whole sort of range. What sort of changes have you seen?
We've definitely seen changes. I think initially we didn't, but then slowly as it's progressed, we've seen more and more people moving into the mobile app or online banking, which is, as Lisa said, it's a bit of a nut to crack sometimes. So in some ways, COVID has pushed that over. I think also, you know, we've got new things like multi-factor authentication and biometrics starting to appear, you know, to help, you know, some of the fraud elements as well around, you know, what we do. I think the mobile app for us is a big thing, and that's probably going to be even more so going forward. So it's going to be like the front door to everything that we do, and something like a wellness app or anything we do in that health could sort of fit in that, or could, you know, have a separate app that sits by it too. We always, well, particularly at the moment, looking at how we can help the most vulnerable. And I think for us, you know, we've started to work out who our more vulnerable are, because I think at the beginning of COVID, we didn't know, like we didn't have a clue. You know, really it wasn't obvious who they were. You could say there's an older generation that, you know, were the most vulnerable, but that didn't necessarily tell you the whole story. So we've started something called Banking My Way, which is helping to understand more of the demographics that we have and where people are challenged maybe with using something, you know, digitally as well, and how we best serve them. So I think definitely seen changes, and I think that's why this whole digital identity piece is really starting to help with that, because I think out of a lot of the things that we did last year, this was one of the pieces that kept being driven forward, because we see that real need now, you know, through what we need to do as a business, but also how we keep, you know, engaging with customers as well. And another thing that's come up is contactless. You know, like everyone's now don't want to be touching that, you know, what's something that I can do without touching. So I think that's made a big difference. So anything that we can do which is contactless is a good thing, it seems, at the moment. So we've sort of almost leaped over some technologies where, you know, contact or touching perhaps is required. We've started to move away from that, and digital ID, you know, QR codes linked to digital ID can all help with that as well. So yeah, probably a lot going on there. It's really helped. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's often our own biases with these things, and we say, you know, these are going to be the set of customers that are going to have a problem with it. You know, and I've been fortunate enough actually to, during my years, to sit in lots of rounds of user testing, and there's, you know, there's been those times where, you know, somebody's come in and they've been in their mid-70s. And they've whizzed through a whole process and they knew what was going on, and everyone's been like, okay, that's completely changed my you know, my view on actually, you know, who are the vulnerable customers, who are the ones that actually potentially need help with these things. And so I'm just going to lead on to the next question, and I'm going to then go to Ruth to get her perspective, which you were talking about contactless being, you know, being something that you think is a shift, Charlotte. Which ones would you say are sort of the most successful, and are there any that you're sort of saying actually that's going to be the, you know, the least successful in terms of sort of customer satisfaction in this space?
Is that for me, sorry? Or
yes,
for...
sorry, yes,
yeah.
yes, for you, yeah.
I think we're sort of testing at the moment. I think, you know, looking at, you know, things like payments, how can you do that in a, you know, contactless way, you know, away from cards, away from what we have already? Is there something about, you know, location payments, you know, which, you know, if you're just in the vicinity of, you can make a payment. I think we've got a number of other ways that we're looking at. There's probably not too much I can share at the moment, but I think there's a lot to explore in the space technology-wise. I think for us, getting the digital ID adopted in some way, then putting whatever else we need to on top of it is probably the way we're going to go, because I think the digital ID piece for us is a big kind of nut to crack, and needs quite a lot of impetus on it to get it up and running in the UK. And if we are going to carry on this journey, that's kind of what we need to do at the moment. But yeah, there's all sorts of interesting things coming up. So
okay, cool. Some of which you can't talk about. Understood.
Strategy. That's the problem.
Ruth, what's your view? So you know, how is, because, you know, Dayon, you've got lots and lots of customers in this space. You've probably got quite a broad kind of cross section as to how you think consumer confidence might have been affected. So what's your view on how things have changed with COVID?
I think, you know, Charlotte made some great points there. We've seen with our existing customers that there has been there was already a significant trend, particularly in the financial services sector, you know, towards that move online, and we saw that with, you know, our financial services customers, particularly the digital onboarding. I think, you know, probably in the past, you know, before COVID, that was being driven an awful lot by the by PSD2, the Second Payment Services Directive, by strong customer authentication, particularly that introduction of biometrics as an authenticator, so, you know, needing 2 factors to authenticate. So that move was already very much there, and then I think that has just been massively accelerated then by the pandemic. So I know, say for example, you know, we work with Standard Chartered Bank, and I know that they had a peak of digital onboarding customers coming on board in March 2020. So when the pandemic hit, you know, it was just so obvious there was a massive spike there, and then we've also seen, you know, increased engagement, say from so new businesses coming to us, and again that challenge, well, how do we get people back to work? So you know, we think, and you say, you know, Emma, maybe none of us ever want to go back to the office, but that's not a choice then for an awful lot of you. Think about, you know, workers in health in hospitals that need to go back in, and, you know, how do they you know, how is there a way to streamline all of that? And, you know, so we've seen like different verticals, different businesses sort of approaching us about that. So definitely very interesting. But I thought, you know, Charlotte touched on something really interesting there, which was, like vulnerable people, and who are those vulnerable people, and how do we bring them into that trust framework? How do we help them to be users? And I thought an interesting example there was voice biometrics. So an awful lot of users maybe who are not are not confident with maybe the facial biometrics, or maybe through disabilities, or the different factors can be come into play there. And I know that one of our customers, PNC, have introduced voice biometrics there as an answer to that. So I just think that's interesting, sort of being aware of what are all of the identity options that are available to try and bring everybody into that ecosystem.
Yeah, sure. And I suspect you've got a good view across a number of different sectors as to what's happening. And are you seeing any customers? I mean, I guess your customers are trying a few different things out. What shifts are you seeing that are being the most successful or least successful, in your opinion, Bruce?
I think that's a tricky question. I think just that move online, I think that was already happening, and I just think it's just been massively accelerated. I suppose getting that really good customer engagement, and it brings us back to, that point about building the trust so that people have the confidence and the trust. And, I suppose I'm always looking at things from a privacy perspective. I sort of feel that a massive part in building that trust is, giving people the right information. So, having a really good maybe communications program, with your customers, engaging with them to try and bring them on board, on that journey with you, so that they have the confidence to, to come with you, and to sort of to move maybe, so from that traditional maybe in branch to online, from a, in the financial space. So I think that's maybe sort of one of the biggest things we'd see.
Okay, and Lisa, have you got a view on that?
On what in particular? Sorry.
So just around, just in terms of how COVID-19 is affecting consumer confidence, how willing people are to do change their habits and move to new online channels.
I think that picking up on what Ruth just said, it is about the confidence, but it's also about the ease of use as well. So pre-COVID, so the majority of our clients have online portals, desktop portals, and the adoption rate is really, really low. And then after COVID, it was still really low. But when you put something on their phone in an app, and it's really easy to use, then that's a really big factor that has played a part in this. And even offering a member an app or to speak to somebody, I don't know what other experiences are, but people don't want to talk to people that they've really become very insular because they've been locked away for so long, so to speak, and they'd much rather do something on their phone to verify their identity than actually pick up a phone and speak to somebody. I mean, there are the exceptions to that, of course, but that's what we found. We found that
Okay.
People are far more.
And just in terms of sort of the identity piece that you use within your service, have you been rethinking how that is deployed with, with your user base or anything like that post-COVID? I mean, because obviously, there was always that way of people being able to do something, by going into a branch or something like that. Have you adopted within your app different ways in which people can do identity verification post COVID-19?
Within the pension, my pension.
Yeah, within pensions, yeah.
So it was purely to stop them having to go into a branch.
Okay.
So pre-COVID, they had the option of going in to verify their identity in person, okay. And post-COVID, of course, that option was taken away from them, and yeah. So the app then became very important to give them that opportunity to verify themselves so they could be paid, but also for the pension provider to know that they're paying the right person and that person is actually alive, which is very difficult to prove when they live abroad. So I think it's £190 billion paid in pension payments every year, and £6 billion of that is fraud. So there's a real need to verify and use identity to verify somebody is actually the right person that you're paying.
Yeah, I think your stats of the uptake and the fact that people have been able to use that app, I think that's really interesting and really compelling. So we've got a few questions actually in the chat box, and if anyone does have any questions, please drop them in. So I'm going to ask some of these. I'm just going to shout some of these questions out. Here we go. Right, so we've got a question here. So it says, how do you see the digital divide barrier playing into digital identity management in the adoption of holistic solutions, especially given over the last 20 years, between 70 to 80% of the population is enabled and engaged. So has anyone got a view just on the kind of digital divide? And we've talked about some of these solutions, you know, Ruth, you were talking about biometrics, you know, Lisa, you're saying we've got that aging population, but they're tending to using apps. We know that in the UK, we've got, I think there's about 11% of people actually can't even turn a device on. So with this move to, you know, to more online, has anyone got a view in terms of, you know, how we get the rest of those people on, given the fact that, you know, people potentially can't go into branches? Has anyone got any comments they want to make on that? Lisa, do you want to go first? Yeah, go on.
So I think the pension sector is a really good example of that, because there is a desire from the individual to use the digital technology to be able to verify themselves, but they don't have the knowledge or the ability to maybe use the digital device. So what we did is we have an online support and a telephone support that support people through using the app, and it might be how they switch on their iPad. I mean, literally, so teaching them how to use the iPad in order to verify their identity. And to give you an example of how successful that's been, our oldest member, or the user, I should say, 93 years old, and they're not alone. There are others in their 90s as well that have successfully used this technology through having that open dialogue with the provider in taking them through in small steps to be able to use that technology. So I think the divide, COVID in particular, will close that divide, because companies will put in place, as Charlotte said, identifying people that are vulnerable and putting in place measures to support those people that are vulnerable, whether it's through voice, as Ruth has mentioned, or whether it's through a support. We will all innovate and we will all solve the problem for sure.
Charlotte, is there anything else you want to add for that from a banking perspective?
Yeah, I was just agreeing wholeheartedly with Lisa. Like, that support is key, and I guess for us, we look at sort of multiple channels. And you know, one thing that's been a huge success, you know, over the last year is our video banking. So connecting with people through Zoom video chat and helping you know, customers take those small steps to get them into more of a digital online world. And you know, we also have AI. We've also been testing some other methods, whether it's through some of the smart devices as well, but we still have our telephony support also. But I think it really is about, you know, small steps, you know, making the bigger change, because we know we also have this whole generation that's coming through now, which has been digital all the way through. So eventually it will get to a point where we'll just be, you know, it will be all digital, you know, with some support for those that can't use, you know, maybe due to some disability, of course. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you say that. I remember sitting in some user testing once, and we had somebody come in who was younger than everybody else that was sat on the other side of the two-way mirror, and that person actually made a statement that the internet was for young people. So it was younger than all of us. So I've got a question here actually that I think I'm going to direct to Ruth, that's come from the audience, which is about wellness passports. So this is from somebody called Frank. He says, I can see a sharp increased need for wellness passports. A number have been suggested and are being explored, but there's a danger of fragmentation when we need to have end-to-end interoperability. Are you optimistic that it could be possible to get convergence and consensus either onto a single universal app or method, or agreement on full interoperability so these apps can work together? Sure.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that that's in everybody's interest, and I think that you know, certainly that would be something that you know, we would be, you know, certainly very interested in. I think probably at the minute where you're seeing alignment is, you know, I suppose maybe we have the experience at the minute in the travel industry, and I know that there's certainly a movement within the sort of the airlines themselves to want to maybe, you know, be interoperable there, so to be consistent as far as possible. So I think where you might see that first emerging, you know, is in the industries and the verticals themselves. They might actually, you know, put their own heads together and think, well, look, how do we make this work, you know, as an industry? So how, for example, you know, if somebody is flying on one airline and they're coming, you know, the connecting flight, you know, would the same health pass work? You know, could they agree themselves that the same health pass would be recognised by all the same airlines? And I think that impetus might come, you know, from the industries themselves. And then, you know, I think again, you know, we take that step back and we think about like the trust framework and we think about trust stamps, and you know, I think that would all be something that could possibly play in here. But you know, like absolutely, you know, if there was a universal standard, you know, I think that would really work well for the interoperability, and that's something that is, you know, to everybody's advantage.
Yeah, and it's early days, isn't it, really? So,
absolutely, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and these things would take a bit of time. I've got another question here from Charlie Laxton. So it says, how secure is the biometric application access on a mobile device? For example, accessing a bank account. I don't know if anybody wants to take that, Ruth or Charlotte. I don't know if you've got a view on. It's quite an open-ended question.
Well, look, you know, I'll certainly answer it from our end. So, you know, we have the ISO, the international standards, security standards. We've the ISO 27001, and then we've the new GDPR add-on there as well. We also have the international security standards for managing data in cloud servers. So I think that there are standards there, and I think that it's important, you know, for any, you know, I think it's important. There are good questions for people to ask. You know, how secure is my information? And it's, you know, that's the type of information that, you know, we're happy to provide. So making sure that, you know, a proper security standards are being applied and being used are all key, you know, to that answer.
Can I just add
something
to that as well? So if you think about the biometrics that are currently on your phone, I often use this example quite a lot. Anyone that has access to your phone can add their fingerprint or their face to your phone. And so using a biometric provider actually makes your biometrics up 100% secure, because it is validated against your passport and your name and your face. Whereas the biometrics on your phone is just, as I say, it's not to an official ID document, to an identity, and that's the difference between the two. So using an actual identity provider is secure, using biometrics on your phone is not.
Charlotte, I don't know if you've got any comments you want to make on that.
No, I was thinking great answers.
Okay, cool. We've got time for, so if anyone else has got any more questions, just pop them in the live chat box and I'll just carry on working through them. So we've got a question here saying, do you think the pensions platform may be exemplar for a common national solution for government? Let me just read the rest of the question. So I think that, so just reading through the question, I think, Lisa, this might be one for you. So do you I think the question is more around, do you think pensions is a way that digital identities could get out to everybody, or do you think perhaps it's more of a silo and a certain percentage of the population?
Well, with auto enrolment, majority of people now have a pension. And the older generation have a pension that is their income. And so I think that it is definitely an opportunity to educate everybody on digital identity and how to use that digital identity, because the majority of the population have a pension, whether they are a youngster that is flitting about from different jobs and they've got multiple pensions. you know, it's really key for them to keep in contact with all of those easily and instantly. We all live in a world now where we expect everything instant, don't we? And so to be able to connect with a pension that's on your phone and you never ever lose control of that, and in the same time you're used to using that an identity provider. I mean, when in the days when you could go on holiday, I used Airbnb, and it used the same similar thing, which I was already familiar with. And so I think the more adoption that the industries have of digital identity, the more used to the population will be in using that. But it's also the education piece about the security around it, like Ruth has said, and making sure that it doesn't have a bad reputation for maybe a provider or a service that hasn't got those standards, and that there's a bad news story attached to that. So having an education piece around it as well is also key.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes back to the trust framework piece again.
Absolutely,
doesn't it? It's just
absolutely.
like how do you know that you can actually trust the
Yeah.
service? How do you know that the actors and the providers within that, you know, within that trust framework are acting according to the rules and how people would expect them? Just going through a few more of the questions to see if there's anything in there. Okay, I've got another question here. Do you see a role for number verify mobile identity services within your respective sectors? Charlotte, do you want to have a go and crack at that one?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was something probably I looked at a couple of years ago, you know, because, you know, most people have a mobile now. So as a piece of, you know, kit that you have with you, and it's something that's attached to your identity as well. I think it is an interesting one. I think it could sort of add another element to an identity. I wouldn't say it is maybe the be all and end all, like the one thing you would use, but you could potentially, you know, use it as another attribute to verify who that person is. And, you know, it might also tell you a little bit more information about, you know, how long that person's had the account, you know, whether it actually sits for that person that you think it does. And it just might help layer out your confidence about that person's identity. But that's sort of all we've looked at, I think, you know, from our side. I don't know if anyone else has, you know, on this group.
I've got a few. I don't know, Lisa, if you, I mean, there's obviously the risks around SIM swap and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So none of these things come with a silver bullet, do they?
No, and from looking at it from the opposite point of view, when you're trying to find somebody and you might have some mobile data available to you that you're trying to find somebody, you can't guarantee that, as Charlotte said, that it is that person, because people do swap around mobile telephone numbers, they do swap SIMs out, they do pay as you go, and so it's really difficult to be able to verify somebody via a phone. But as Charlotte has also said, having that as a piece of the identity, and maybe that's already been verified and that sits behind your biometric identity, that may work. So if you needed to share that, then you could share it as an authenticated telephone number.
Okay, so I've got one last question because we've got about 6 minutes left, and then I'm going to hand back to Alan to wrap up. So my last question is, you know, I think we're all probably trying to think forward and going, you know, hopefully, you know, Ruth's given us a view of how we're going to be able to get back on flights again. We're going to be able to go on holiday. You know, I sit every night going, where would I go if I could go somewhere? But I think my question is, what changes? Because, you know, you can kind of imagine that we get to the other side of this and whatever this is. And, you know, some things may roll back to the way that they were, you know, perhaps consumers' attitudes or, you know, behaviours might roll back, but some will probably stay permanent. So, Ruth, I'm really interested in terms of, regardless of kind of COVID-19, what do you think in terms of consumer attitudes and behaviours are going to stay permanent?
Yeah, I think that they will. And I think, to what Lisa said earlier on, it's very interesting to hear the example that she used about the applications, and that, people are on their device, people have their phone on them all of the time. And, maybe people who are resistant to, say, going online, previously, it involved opening up their laptop or whatever, but when it's on their phone and the device and the applications, and that's certainly something that we've seen, is that and trying to build into the design to make it user friendly, so that if things are user friendly in the applications, that I think that's with us to stay. So that move away, say for example, from the branch to online, to that has been made easier now in the application, and I think that's probably here to stay. I think, sure, our lives are moving more and more online, and I don't think there's any sign of that that changing after the pandemic. I think it's just accelerated it.
Do you think that, you talked a bit about biometrics? Do you think we're going to see a bigger shift towards something like biometrics? Do you think that will be a permanent thing?
Yeah, I do, and I think that people, that there's a good story there, and I think that it's people, build their confidence and their trust, and again, the trust framework's a huge part of that people understand how they're used, and Lisa made that great point about how they can be more secure, and the different things to look for in providers. I think that is all part of that story, and we are seeing increased use of biometrics, and I think that that's definitely part of we'll see that continuing for sure.
Yeah, we'll stay. And Charlotte, have you got a view on that, just quickly?
Yep. So yes, I agree. I think the behaviour change, and the adoption that we've seen in the last year really does sort of make you think that we're going to see more and more people online. I think one thing that I do think also is we talk a lot about climate at the moment, and identity, and a digital identity can maybe go some way to addressing some of that. Instead of us asking for someone to go into the branch, bring a document, all of the paper travel that goes along with that, this, that could actually, change, what we're doing around climate. If we go into digital identity, that could help potentially some of the adoption of good behaviours, and use less of, the travel that we've had in the past. So I think with pandemic, climate, I think it's all going to keep moving that same way that Ruth was talking about as well. I think we're going to be more and more online, and more engaged online as well. That's how we're building our journeys out anyway.
Okay, that's interesting. And Ruth said that you can shut your branches, so
not quite yet. Not yet.
Not quite yet. And Lisa, last from you, and then I'm going to hand back over to Alan.
Yeah, I agree. I think as long as we don't make it too complicated for the user, and it's really an easy process and the easy journey, they will continue to go down that road.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, all of you. Really great insights. And I'm going to hand over to Alan just to make the closing remarks. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you to all our panelists. Let me just get a slide up. Bear with me. My apologies. There we go. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and all our panelists for joining us today and sharing their insight and expertise with us. I hope you've all taken away something of value from today's virtual meeting. If we didn't manage to get around to answering any of your questions, we should be following up with them to ensure that they get an answer. Also, the recording from today's event will be available shortly, and we'll be in touch with the details in how to access this. On that note, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and look out for future events from Good Intelligence in the future. So stay safe. Thank you.